Welcome, future rulers and professional schemers. Today we're diving into Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince. Written in 1513, this book is the ultimate guide to climbing the political ladder without losing your crown or your head. It's like a how to succeed in business without really trying for Renaissance despots, filled with advice on power, manipulation, and how to keep your enemies shaking in their boots. Machiavelli was basically the guy who said, "Why be nice when you can be feared?" And honestly, that energy is giving main character vibes. Strap in, because we're about to Machiavelli our way to the top. Before we get into the wait, wrong book. Let's talk about Machiavelli. Niccolò was a 16th century Italian diplomat and political thinker who lived in Florence. Now, if you know anything about the Italian Renaissance, you know it was a time of incredible art, culture, and also, a shocking amount of political intrigue. Seriously, they should have had their own reality TV show called The Real Housewives of Florence. Anyway, Machiavelli was right in the thick of it. He wasn't just some ivory tower scholar. He worked in the government, went on diplomatic missions, saw firsthand how power worked, and how it was abused. He even got exiled for a bit. Think of it like being grounded, but instead of your parents, it's the entire ruling Medici family. And speaking of the Medicis, Machiavelli dedicated The Prince to them. Yeah, awkward much? It's like writing a tell-all book about your ex and then dedicating it to their mom, but hey, Machiavelli was nothing if not ambitious. He hoped that by laying out his brutally honest advice, he could get back in the Medici's good graces. Okay, let's get real for a second. Have you ever noticed that people are more likely to do what you want if they're a little bit afraid of you? Don't judge, it's human nature. And Machiavelli knew this better than anyone. He straight up said, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." Now before you go full-on supervillain, remember Machiavelli wasn't saying you have to be a tyrant. It's not about being cruel for the sake of it, it's about being respected, even if that means being a little intimidating. Think of it like this. A lion isn't constantly roaring and attacking everything in sight, but it does make its presence known. It commands respect, and everyone knows not to mess with it. Machiavelli's point is that being loved is great, but it can be fleeting. People are fickle. They change their minds, they get swayed by emotions, they start following the next shiny object. Fear, on the other hand, is a much more stable emotion. It makes people think twice before crossing you. Basically, be the kind of person who doesn't have to raise their voice to be heard, you know? Alright, time for Machiavelli's most infamous and often misunderstood quote, "The ends justify the means." Now before you go off starting any wars or anything, let's unpack this a bit. On the surface it sounds kinda harsh, right? Like do whatever you gotta do, even if it's shady, not exactly. Machiavelli wasn't saying that morality is completely irrelevant, he was just being pragmatic. He knew that in the real world, especially in the cutthroat world of politics, sometimes you have to make tough choices. Think of it like this, you're playing a strategy game, right? And your goal is to win. You wouldn't just send all your troops into battle blindly, would you? No, you'd think strategically, you'd use your resources wisely, and sometimes, yeah, you might have to make a move that seems a little ruthless. But here's the thing, even when you're playing to win, it's important to be aware of the bigger picture. Machiavelli wasn't just about fear and power. He also understood the importance of, not being a one-dimensional jerk. He famously said, "A prince must be like a fox and a lion." The fox, of course, represents cunning, intelligence, and the ability to outsmart your opponents. The lion, on the other hand, is all about strength, courage, and the ability to, roar really loud when necessary. In other words, don't just be a bully. Be smart about it. Use your brain, think strategically, and always be a few steps ahead of your enemies. But also, don't be afraid to stand up for yourself, to fight for what you believe in, and to show the world that you're not someone to be messed with. It's a delicate balance, to be sure. Ever heard the phrase, keep your friends close and your enemies closer? Yeah, Machiavelli basically invented that. He was all about knowing who to trust, which, let's be honest, is a valuable skill in any century. He advised rulers to keep a close eye on everyone, not just their obvious rivals. Friends can become enemies, enemies can become allies, and sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you really need to watch out for. Think of it like this. You're hosting a dinner party. You've got your inner circle at the table, but you've also invited that one frenemy who's always trying to one-up you. Are you doing it because you actually enjoy their company? Debatable. The point is, Machiavelli understood the importance of information. Okay, let's be real. None of us are perfect. We all have our flaws, our insecurities, our moments where we just want to stay in bed and binge watch reality TV. But Machiavelli would tell us to get up, put on our game face, and pretend to be the best version of ourselves, even if we don't quite feel like it. He famously said, "A prince should appear merciful, faithful, humane, upright, and religious, but only when it suits him." And look, on the surface, this might sound a little, well, fake. But think about it, we all do this to some extent, right? We put our best foot forward in job interviews, we try to be on our best behavior around our in-laws, we pretend to like our friend's new haircut even though it looks like a squirrel died on their head. Machiavelli's point is that appearances matter. The way you present yourself to the world can have a huge impact on how people perceive you and, more importantly, how much power you're able to wield. Now before you go full-on villain, remember, Machiavelli might have been a fan of fear, but he wasn't a monster. He understood that there's a fine line between being respected and being despised. He wrote, "A wise prince must avoid being despised or hated." Why? Because if people hate you, they're more likely to, overthrow you and replace you with someone who doesn't make their lives miserable. Not exactly a recipe for a long and successful reign. So how do you walk this tightrope between fear and loathing? It's all about being strategic with your ruthlessness. Don't be cruel just for the sake of it. Don't make enemies unnecessarily. And if you do have to make a tough call, at least try to make it look like you're doing it for the greater good. Think of it like this, you're a teacher, right? And you've got a student who just won't stop talking. You could go full-on drill sergeant and yell at them in front of the whole class, but that's probably going to backfire. Instead, you could try a more subtle approach. Okay, let's be real. The Prince is over 500 years old. It was written in a time when people still thought the earth was flat and you could cure a cold with leeches. So, why are we still talking about it? Because even though the world has changed a lot since Machiavelli's time, human nature really hasn't. We're still the same ambitious, power-hungry, gossip-loving creatures we've always been. And Machiavelli's insights into how to navigate this messy, complicated world are still surprisingly relevant. Think about it. How many times have you been in a situation where you had to negotiate, persuade, or just plain outsmart someone to get what you wanted? He teaches us to be strategic, to think ahead, to understand the motivations of others. Now it's important to acknowledge that not all of Machiavelli's advice is exactly ethical. Let's be real, the dude could be pretty ruthless. He wasn't afraid to advocate for deception, manipulation, and even violence when he thought it was necessary. And look, I get it, the world can be a tough place. Sometimes it feels like everyone's out for themselves, and it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that you have to be ruthless to survive. But here's the thing. Even Machiavelli understood that there's more to life than just winning at all costs. He knew that true power comes from building strong relationships, earning the respect of others, and, not being a complete jerk all the time. So yes, learn from Machiavelli, study his strategies, understand his insights into human nature, and don't be afraid to channel your inner cunning when you need to. Okay, let's have some fun with this. Imagine for a second that Machiavelli was alive today. What would he be doing? What kind of chaos would he be causing? I'm picturing him as a social media influencer, dropping truth bombs about power dynamics and manipulation tactics. He'd have millions of followers on TikTok, where he'd post videos like, "How to gaslight your rivals and still look like the good guy," or 5 Machiavellian tips for crushing your next job interview. He'd be a guest shark on Shark Tank, where he'd ruthlessly dismantle entrepreneurs' pitches with lines like, "Your business plan is as weak as your handshake. I'm out." He'd be a political commentator, offering up scathing critiques of world leaders with his signature blend of wit and cynicism. Basically, Machiavelli in the modern world would be a force to be reckoned with. So, what's the verdict? The Prince isn't a book about being nice. It's about surviving and thriving in a chaotic world. Machiavelli's lessons are harsh, but they're also smart. Be strategic, be adaptable, and if all else fails, remember, it's better to be feared than loved. But don't forget, even Machiavelli knew the importance of balance. A little fear is good, but too much? You're asking for a rebellion. So, play smart, stay sharp, and maybe don't betray your besties over a promotion.